Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's guest is a legendary Emmy Award winning producer and director who created some of the most iconic moments in American pop culture and entertainment history in TV specials starring Petula Clark, Barry Manilow, Diana Ross, Liza Minnelli, John Denver, Patti LaBelle, Smokey Robinson, Olivia Newton-John, and many more. But he is perhaps best known for producing and directing the spectacular 1968 Elvis Presley Comeback TV special that is widely considered to have solidified Elvis's legacy as one of the most profound cultural icons of the 20th century. Our guest has written a fabulous book entitled Elvis 68 Comeback: The Story Behind the Special. And if you're an Elvis fan, this book is a must-have because unlike the dozens of other books out there about this landmark TV special, this book is the only one written by the person who actually conceived of, produced, and directed the show and who worked so closely with Elvis. And it's just been announced that our guest will be producing a documentary film to be released next year, which will take us behind the scenes and reveal the almost constant drama that surrounded the making of this iconic and mesmerizing show. If you've seen Elvis's Comeback TV special, you know that something truly magical happened. It was a pivotal event in television and music history, capturing over 40% of the television viewing audience and becoming one of the highest rated television shows ever made. And it was a major turning point in Elvis's career, made possible by the artistic vision and determination of our guest, Mr. Steve Binder. Steve, welcome to our show, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Harvey, for inviting me. And wow, I couldn't have written that opening better myself. Thank you.
Steve, when you look at the state of Elvis's career in 1968, he seemed to have become irrelevant. It was a time of the Beatles, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and Elvis had been making a string of mostly forgettable movies. You wrote that Colonel Parker was trying to transform Elvis the rebel into Elvis the family entertainer. But that wasn't your vision for the show at all, was it?
I truly never considered doing a special with Elvis in the first place. That came out of left field. And largely responsible was the preceding special I did with Petula Clark and Harry Belafonte. I didn't know if I even wanted to work with Elvis Presley because he was from originally Tupelo, Mississippi, the deep South in America. He then settled in Tennessee, in Memphis, bought Graceland. And I had seen Elvis as a West Coast kid who was into the Beach Boys and Jan and Dean. At the time, my company with my partner at the time, Bones Howe, were exclusively producing all the hit records for the Fifth Dimension, the Association, Laura Nyro we were starting to record with. I didn't know if Elvis and I had anything in common. First of all, I had to meet the Colonel to get his permission to meet Elvis Presley. It was really almost humorous when I met him because he told me the special was already conceived by himself and NBC, and it was going to follow in the footsteps of our big middle-of-the-road performers and comedians like Steve Allen, Milton Berle, Andy Williams. They annually were doing Christmas shows. I had the opportunity to do a few before that I turned down and didn't want to do, and I certainly didn't want to do it with Elvis Presley. I first was exposed to him when he did the Ed Sullivan shows, and he was fantastic. He had his original trio with him, and they did the staple, hound dog type recordings that he made early on in his career. And so even meeting him to find out if I wanted to work with him was contingent upon meeting Colonel Parker. I didn't know what to expect, but I drove out to MGM Studios in Culver City, where the Colonel conducted business and had his offices. And I walked in the door, and immediately he presented me with a gift. And it was his infamous Snowman's Club membership. And if anybody, I'm sure all the Elvis fans certainly know that the Snowman's Club was nothing more than if Colonel Parker thought you were a good BSer and could pull the wool over people's eyes and so forth. And there was my membership card with my name typed in, a booklet explaining the rules of the club. And it was immediately very humorous because it cost nothing to become a member if he invited you into the club, but it cost you a small fortune if you wanted to get out of it. That was typical Colonel Parker. So the Colonel told me that NBC and he had agreed on Elvis was going to don a cashmere sweater or a Perry Como type looking sweater. There was going to be a fireplace and a Christmas tree. And he was then going to proceed without any dialogue, singing 20 Christmas songs or so. I instantly knew, the meeting was a disaster. I wasn't even, let alone work with Elvis, I wasn't going to do a Christmas special with Elvis Presley. I didn't say anything. He then presented me with what the Colonel and Elvis and RCA Records gave to disc jockeys all over America, which was a 1/4-inch audio tape of 20 Christmas songs that Elvis sang with no dialogue. I accepted, had Elvis's picture on the front cover, and it was their gift to disc jockeys. And when I got in the car to go back to my office, I knew the meeting was a disaster. It wasn't going to happen. To my shock and surprise, when I got to my office, there was a phone call waiting for me from who turned out to be a great executive producer on the special, Bob Finkel. And he said, I don't know what you did, Steve, to charm the Colonel, but he's approved you and you can now meet Elvis. And Elvis is coming to your office tomorrow at 4 p.m. and you can have your one-on-one conversation. Because as much as the Colonel had put conditions on me, I reversed it and said, before I make any decision, I want to meet Elvis Presley one-on-one, no entourage, no Colonel, just the two of us, and see if we're compatible and if we want to work together.
Well, when Elvis asked you where you thought his career was at back when you first met him, you told him his career was in the toilet. Where did you get the guts to be so brutally honest with him?
To be honest with you, Harvey, I never was intimidated by anybody that I worked with, no matter how famous they were. I always thought of it as a team sport entertainment, and you need to surround yourself with the best people you can find to work with. Elvis's or the star's job is to come off great and entertain the public, and my job was to make them look good. When it came to stars, I felt I had my job to do, they had their job to do, and we should deal with it on equal terms. I saw myself when I got involved with Elvis, and our first meeting was actually great because I found, even though we were 2,000 miles apart from each other in our upbringing, et cetera, we had a lot in common. And the redneck that I was expecting to meet, I never met because he treated everybody great and equally. He was going to Hawaii on vacation to get in shape for the special. And I said, I'm going to put my team together, Elvis. When you get back from Hawaii, we'll pitch it to you. If you like it, we'll do it. If you don't like it, we'll shake hands and walk away being friends. And we met. And he liked that idea, and that took off. And I put my team together.
Well, let me ask you this then, Steve. When you look at Elvis's TV appearances before you did the comeback special, I always thought he was treated as a novelty act and not as a serious artist. So what was your strategy to present Elvis as a true rock and roll artist that would be current and relevant and get him to reconnect with his roots?
Well, I didn't have to convince him of that. That's what he wanted from day one. In fact, when we had our first meeting at my office, just the two of us alone, he expressed the fear that the audiences had passed him up, that now was the era of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were in America and all these great English rock and rollers. And he had gone in the army and then spent a good 8 years making these movies and no live appearances anywhere. And he really felt strongly, if I come back, nobody's going to want me to perform for them. The teenagers was a new generation and they had moved on. And he asked me, what if the special bombs? And I said, then you'll be remembered as the guy who sang Hound Dog and Blue Suede Shoes, and the guy that went in the army and came back and made a whole bunch of basically B movies. He said to me in this meeting, he said, I don't want to do television anymore. Exactly as you just said, he said to me, television in America in prime time was dominated by singers and comics, middle of the road singers. And he said, it's not my turf. And I said, what's your turf? And he said, making rock and roll records. And I said back, then you make rock and roll records and I'll put pictures to them. And he told me much later that those words really relaxed him. When he first met me and he saw all of our gold records on the wall for our music artists, I think he instantly got relaxed because he knew he just wasn't in the world of television.
You made it clear in your book that you helped Elvis defy Colonel Parker with his creative choices. As you know, so much has been written and said about Colonel Parker. You described him in your book as a childish bully who took advantage of other people's weaknesses. And you compared him to the Wizard of Oz, the con man behind the curtain. He was a bizarre person, to say the least. At one point, you saw him trying to hypnotize Elvis's entourage into believing they were farm animals. What did you think was really going on in this relationship between the Colonel and Elvis?
Harvey, you've really done your homework. Boy, you know as much as I do. And you're absolutely right. I had the best executive producer one could have on a special because Bob Finkel, who was a 50s generation ahead of me, producer director himself, initially wanted to produce and direct the show himself. The problem was that he didn't know that Elvis didn't want to do television. The Colonel knew it, but didn't tell Elvis that he had made this deal with NBC. And as a result, Elvis was blindsided when he found out that Colonel Parker made a deal with NBC, and the deal had nothing to do with television. He had run dry of getting financing from the movie studios to make another movie, and he was prepared to make Mary Tyler Moore, Change of Habit, Elvis film, but he had no financing to do it, so he decided to go to the television networks. They had lots of money, and he met with Tom Sarnoff, who was the head of NBC in Burbank in those days. And he and Sarnoff worked out this deal, but Sarnoff was clever enough to say, okay, we'll put up the money for his movie on one condition. And the Colonel wasn't used to anybody saying things like that to him. And he said, what's the condition? That Elvis do a 1-hour television special. Well, the Colonel agreed to it, but did not tell Elvis because he knew that Elvis did not want to do television. So he kept it to the last minute. The situation with Colonel Parker is that the Colonel had a strong relationship with what I understand with Vernon, Elvis's father. And when he couldn't get Elvis to do anything, he'd just go to his father and his father would talk him into it. And Elvis basically, coming from Tupelo, Mississippi and telling me in my first meeting with him that he never even saw white people for the first few years of his life. He was in this poor neighborhood where they were basically picking cotton. As a result, Elvis was incredibly loyal, not just to his family, but anybody who got involved in his life. And the Colonel, incidentally, Harvey, in my opinion, because you have to realize my world with Elvis Presley only was about 6 months long from beginning to end. I never met him until I started the special. And the last time I saw him, when I said goodbye and we were going to reconnect, never happened. So I was persona non grata basically on the Colonel's list, and he did not want me around to influence Elvis, because you have to realize that Elvis did anything and everything I asked him to do enthusiastically. He was ready to go. Once he made the commitment to work with me, as a matter of fact, I was a little nervous because every star I had worked with up to then always had suggestions, quote unquote. And when we pitched him the show that you saw in the 68 special, it was almost exactly, minus the improv section, exactly as Alan Bly and Chris Beard's outline as writers. That's what we executed with the gospel segment, the guitar man segment, etc. We hadn't picked the closing number, even though the Colonel kept saying it's going to be a Christmas song or it's going to be an old Frankie Lane song from the 40s, I guess, or early 50s. You know, I had no intention of ever doing that. And you have to realize that, which I never did, the Colonel had no say in the show. It was the first time ever, I think, that Elvis said, I don't care what you think, Colonel Parker, I'm doing whatever this Binder is telling me to do. And I just have a gut feeling something's going to happen that I want to happen.
Well, are you surprised, Steve? Given the many battles that you had with Colonel Parker, and it's all explained in your book, were you surprised that you never got fired?
All the time. It was a total shock to me because after Elvis had passed away, I was asked to do a film with Priscilla on touring Elvis's Graceland. And she said to me, when Elvis came home from his first meeting with me at my offices on the Sunset Strip, he told Priscilla, I don't care what the Colonel tells me, what he thinks about the special, I'm going with Binder because I have a gut feeling that he knows what he's doing, and I like, you know, where his head is at and his background, and I like the fact he's in the music business. I like the fact that he's as young as I am, and so it was a perfect marriage. But I never knew any of that, and as it turned out, Colonel Parker kept losing battle after battle after battle, and I didn't have to deal with him. Bob Finkel took the brunt of it. He kept the Colonel entertained away from Elvis and myself throughout the production. They played liar's poker. They exchanged gifts with each other. You know, Bob was the perfect person to handle Parker. And I don't think Parker even realized what was going on, but we intentionally excluded him from every major discussion we had. Certainly, I never remember him being on stage when we were actually taping the show or even in rehearsals. He prided himself the day I met Colonel Parker that he and Elvis were strictly a business relationship. They never socialized together. They never went to each other's homes for a meal. And Elvis verified that, telling me the same thing by himself, that he had no interest in, you know, making Colonel Parker a friend. I absolutely give the Colonel credit at the beginning of Elvis's career when Sam Phillips, who owned Sun Records, sold his contract to Colonel Parker, who in turn raised the money from RCA Records to deliver Elvis to RCA. Elvis, unfortunately, out of this false sense of eternal loyalty, stuck with the Colonel all the way through his career. I think at the very end, it was too late to even get out because the Colonel knew so much negative things that he always threatened Elvis he would expose. if Elvis tried to leave him. For me, it's all folklore because the only information I have is first person when I was with Elvis and when I met him on the first day at my office and the last day when we were at Bill Ballew's apartment in Hollywood, supposedly getting ready to have a beer and pizza party of the wrap of the special. And Elvis snuck me very secretively, gave me a piece of paper and whispered to me in my ear, here's a number you can always reach me and, use it. And they drove off. When I called that number that Elvis handed me, it was already intercepted by the Colonel's people, and they wouldn't put me through, and I never ever spoke to Elvis or saw him again. But
well, let me ask you, Steve, you mentioned Elvis's loyalty. Was there anything else about Elvis's personality that really surprised you?
That he was so easy to work. He was so enthusiastic about all the material we gave him to do and put his heart and soul in it. I mean, when we eventually brought DJ and Scotty in to be involved in the improvisation acoustic segments, the amazing thing about that, which I don't think to this day the public either acknowledges or realizes, that was true improvisation. I didn't even write down the list of songs that I wanted him to sing, that he was singing in the dressing room while he was living at NBC. And it was absolutely amazing. When I sent him out on the stage to do the acoustic, nothing was planned. Those guys didn't rehearse together. They didn't plan anything. They just got up there and did it like they did it, years and years earlier. And it was phenomenal. I mean, I was constantly, for a guy who told me he didn't even want to go out there because he didn't want to embarrass himself because he didn't remember anything he did in the dressing room sessions. I just insisted that he go out there and at the very least say hello and goodbye to the audience that was waiting to see him and hear him. And then he could come back and at least he did it. Well,
oh, he sure did it all right. You ended up showing us the real Elvis. And
well, I had to almost, in that old vaudeville cliche, I almost had to get the hook to get him off the stage. He did 2 hours of improv and it was brilliant.
it really was brilliant. I'm fascinated by your choice of Billy Goldenberg as music director. He was a classically trained Broadway composer, conductor, and arranger from New York, working with Elvis, who was a rock and roll star from the South. And their work together is one of the greatest collaborations in music history. How did you know that putting them together would create such magic?
Thank you, Harvey. I mean, I could not agree with you more. Billy was my musical arranger when I first started directing, and I did a show called Hullabaloo in New York. When I got the Presley special, I asked Elvis if there's anybody in his world that he wanted me to hire on the staff. And he thought about it a minute. There's one person I'd like you to hire. His name is Billy Strange. He works on my music once in a while, and I'd like him to be my music director. In my head all the time, I wanted to hire Billy Goldenberg, but that's the only person that Elvis asked me to hire. And so I said, okay, I will do it. And I did. I called Billy Strange. I hired him. At the time, I did not know that Billy was working with Nancy Sinatra. They had just produced a single that was a hit record called These Boots Are Made for Walking. Their record company was screaming at them, we need an album. You got to get in the studio immediately with Nancy and record 9 or 10 more songs so we can fill out an album. In the meantime, not knowing any of this, I'm saying Elvis is coming to my office to start rehearsals on the Presley special. I need the music for the rehearsal pianist to start rehearsing with Elvis the songs that we're doing on the show. Billy Strange said, "No problem, Steve. I'll have them for you." I thought nothing more of it until we start getting closer and closer to the date Elvis is showing up at my office. And I have no music. So I'm calling Billy Strange almost daily saying, "Where's the music?" "Don't worry, Steve, it'll be there." I said, "You can't do that to me, Billy. You're talking about Elvis Presley. I want that music on my desk ready to rehearse when he walks in the door." Another few days go by, no music. I finally called Billy Strange and I said, "Okay, Billy, you forced me into this, but next Monday, if you do not have lead sheets on my desk, you're fired." And Billy Strange said, "You can't fire me, Steve. I know Elvis Presley a hell of a lot better than you do." And I said, "Then one of us is going to be gone the next morning, but I'm telling you, if you don't get those lead sheets on my desk, you're fired come Monday morning." Monday morning comes around and no lead sheets, no music. First I called Bob Finkel, my executive producer, and I said, "Bob, I'm firing Billy Strange." He said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay." And next call I make is to Billy Strange, and I said, "You're fired." "Well, you can't fire me. I told you I know Elvis a lot better than you do, and he'll definitely keep me on the show and get rid of you." I said, "So be it." Get a call from Colonel Parker. "I hear you fired Billy Strange." "You don't know what you've done, Steve. Elvis is probably going to refuse to even come to work on Monday." I said, "That's his call." Next thing, I show up on Monday morning. Elvis is there and he said, "Steve, what happened?" I explained to him exactly what I just told you. And he says, "Okay." And we move on. And not another word, never hear the name Billy Strange again. I then run to the phone, called Billy Goldenberg in New York, and I said, "Billy, I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, you've got to get on an airplane today and come to LA and do the Elvis Presley special."
And the rest, as they say, is history. Just before you were going to film the improv segment, Elvis got severe stage fright, and he told you he couldn't remember what he was supposed to do. How did you get him to overcome his nervousness and go on stage?
I didn't overcome his nervousness. As a matter of fact, you can actually see when you watch the original '68 special, you can see his throat dried up, as does with the people who are nervous, and especially singers. He had to start over, but that was all part of the charm. What happened was when he called me down to what turned out to be the makeup room and he asked everybody to leave, he had to talk to me alone, one-on-one. He told me that exactly as you just said, that he couldn't remember anything that he did, let alone a week before, a minute before. He couldn't remember any songs he sang in the dressing room. He couldn't remember any of the stories he told, like when the Vice Squad used to show up and he had to use his little finger to, instead of move his body for fear of being arrested by the Vice Squad, etc. Elvis was human. I mean, a special human, yes, but he was human. And people forget, and especially with the image that the estate is trying to maintain, there were no women in his life past Priscilla, which is obviously not the truth. I think the great part of the special, Harvey, and the thing I'm most proud of, is realizing that he rediscovered himself doing that special. I think he really felt strongly that the Colonel, RCA, their publicity machines were making him super famous, not realizing it was him, it was his charisma, it was his talent. And I think, to restore faith in himself was my real job as a director and a director-producer. And
boy, did you do that, Steve. I mean, besides the acoustic improv segment, one of the most memorable parts of that show was the final number, "If I Can Dream," which became an instant classic. Take us back to that time when you watched him sing that song in the recording studio and on the stage.
Well, first of all, the Colonel had lost every battle imaginable that he brought to the show and had sold NBC, and realized, that he was irrelevant in the special. I mean, he never got anything he wanted. First, he wanted 20 Christmas songs or 26 Christmas songs. Then he would settle for one if I just put one in. When I finished that special, truthfully, Harvey, I had programmed no Christmas songs in it, period. And the only reason, and it may have saved the show, when the Colonel told NBC, unless Binder puts a Christmas song in the show, I'm not going to let you even air it. And so they were panicked. They called me to the executive towers at NBC, and there's the Colonel, with his steel blue eyes staring at me as if he can hypnotize me or control me, which was the furthest thing from the truth. They're saying we have a dilemma, and the dilemma is the Colonel won't let us air the show until we put a Christmas song in. And I said, there are no Christmas songs. I never programmed one. But it occurred to me that during the improv, I think Elvis sang one or two Christmas songs acoustically. And they said, well, Colonel, and they looked right at him, and they said, if Steve can find those songs or a song, will you let us air the show if he replaces one of the songs already in the show and puts in a Christmas song instead? The Colonel pondered the question for a while and finally nodded his head and said, something like, I guess so, or I think so. So I went down to the editing room, pulled out all the outtakes and the old material, and darned if I didn't find Blue Christmas and another song, Christmas song. And that's when it got inserted. But had I not had that in the improv, we'd finished shooting the show for weeks by the time that meeting took place. It would have been impossible.
So tell me about If I Can Dream. I understand it was inspired by the assassination of Bobby Kennedy.
Well, what happened was we're in my office with Billy Goldenberg, Alan Bly, Chris Beard was there, our writers, and Earl Brown's in there as well. And we're rehearsing, and we hear a commotion in one of my other offices where we have a TV set on. And it turned out to be live on television, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. So we all get up and we rush into the TV room and watch that on television until it's over. Then we go back to my office, and until about 3 or 4 in the morning, we're only discussing what's going on in America with all these assassinations. Elvis was really into it. I mean, he knew a whole lot about Martin Luther King's death. It was unbelievable because that evening sort of pulled our family to even more together than we were previously. There was so much emotion and compassion in the room. And how do we express this on the show without becoming macabre? And it was a case of where Earl Brown, who is our choral director and a really good writer, at the time I didn't even think of it, but I was always, throughout the entire production, searching for a closing song. I finally brought Billy and Earl in and said, guys, the Colonel is screaming for a Christmas song. I said, I know I can't, as normally on Christmas endings, the host, be it Andy Williams or Perry Como, they talk to the audience and thank them for watching their Christmas special and so forth. I want to do it in music where we disguise it. I know the Colonel will not allow Elvis to talk as a human being, but let's write a song that expresses exactly what we know about him now and how he feels. And so they go off. And a few days later, I get a telephone call from Earl saying, I think we've got it. And so I came in early the next morning to listen to it. The minute Elvis walked back into his dressing room, we pulled him into the piano, and Earl sang and Billy played the piano. They now perform it for Elvis. Elvis is by himself with us in the dressing room. Elvis typically says, play it again. He doesn't comment whether he likes it or dislikes it or whatever. Play it again. So after maybe 4 or 5 times that these guys are playing If I Can Dream, Elvis looks at me and he nods his head. I can, in the meantime, hear the Colonel and Freddie Beanstalk, his publishing guy, in the next room saying, basically the Colonel is saying, over my dead body, will Elvis ever sing that? I don't know what he thought of the song, but probably not very highly of it. And in the meantime, Elvis says, I'll do it.
Now, when you showed the finished product of the TV special to Elvis in the screening room, what was his reaction?
The first time we saw it was at NBC, as you said, in the screening room, which only held maybe 15 bodies. As we watched it, it was a horrible experience for me because there was no reaction from anybody.
None?
The entourage is waiting for Elvis to react. Elvis is not reacting, so they're not reacting. And I'm sitting there, uncomfortable as could be, saying, which I usually say when I finish a show, this is a disaster, you know. And then Elvis, when they finished showing the show, he says, okay, I want all you guys to leave now. I'm going to watch it again with just Steve, just the two of us. So they pile out. So they all leave, and now we play the show again. And as inanimate as Elvis was for the screening with his entourage in the screening room, is the opposite of what happens now. He is laughing, he is applauding himself. I mean, you'd think he was the biggest egomaniac in the world, but he loved it. And he told me he would never sing a song again in his life that he didn't believe in. He'd never do a movie. He didn't like the director. He wanted to meet his fans around the world. He goes on and on and on. And I said, Elvis, I hear you, but after observing for the past few months what's been going on, I don't know if you're strong enough to stand up to the Colonel. I wish I never said it. I wish it wasn't true, but it turned out to be true.
But you actually did have the courage after you showed him the finished product and he told you he was happy with the show.
He loved it.
You gave him that advice. You told him that he needed to take control of his life, even if that meant breaking away from Colonel Parker. What was his response?
It was hard to read. He just, as he listened, I knew he was absorbing what I was saying. And I told him, you know, the role I'm playing is not a television producer director. I'm playing Jiminy Cricket in a Walt Disney movie. I'm here to tell you the truth, give you advice, and you listened to me. You did anything and everything I asked you to do. And, you know, it's up to you. I personally think all the doors are open to you again because of this special. I personally think it will be a huge hit because this is what the world has been waiting for your entire career, is to see the real Elvis, and all they've gotten to see over these years is kind of a performance, you know, programmed Elvis that's not you. You're the king of rock and roll.
So he heard your advice, but the impression you got was that he just couldn't absorb it. He was not going to be able to take it.
No, I left with the feeling there was a 50-50 chance that he would. And when I went to see him and was not allowed to even say hello to him, they had already gotten the word from Parker that I was persona non grata at that point. I thought he was fantastic. I thought he was every bit as good in Las Vegas when he opened at the hotel. What I never realized when I brought Billy Goldenberg in and we did this special, that Elvis had never sang with an orchestra in his life. He'd only sang with his trio. They'd go home and then they'd bring all the musicians in to overdub. And this was the first time he walked into a recording studio and saw 50 musicians sitting there waiting for him. And he called me out on Sunset Boulevard for the second time and said, "Steve, I've never sung with an orchestra before. You got to promise me. I've never heard a Billy Goldenberg arrangement. You have to promise me that if I don't like what I hear or see, you'll send all the musicians home except keep the rhythm section for me." And I promised him I would do that. And we walked in. He walked up to Billy Goldenberg's music podium, conductor podium, and the rest is history. He never uttered a negative word about anything we did musically on the show. And I think that the soundtrack of the 68 special is as relevant and made the special so special. It was actually the group that then became the Wrecking Crew and acknowledged as the best studio musicians in the history of the West Coast.
Oh, everyone knows the Wrecking Crew was legendary. It just troubles me so much that you gave Elvis this advice. I think he must have understood that you were right. The Colonel knew that that special was a huge success and that that's because of you. And yet the Colonel did everything to keep him away from you because obviously the Colonel was threatened. It must have got back to him that you had suggested to Elvis that he needed to break away from the Colonel.
Well, I didn't blatantly just come out and say, you need to get rid of him. I mean, that was Elvis's choice. I felt from day one, I mean, the Colonel was a total con artist. I mean, the real story surface hasn't been scratched of the history of the Colonel.
Not even in this latest movie?
No. There's a book by a friend of mine, an author named Alana Nash, who went back to the Netherlands where the Colonel was born, and she really researched him with his family and friends and what have you. And I'll just throw one tidbit at you. The Colonel joins the United States Army pre-World War II and is discharged for mental reasons.
Oh, wow.
It just story after story.
Isn't that telling?
And the truth, and I only like to speak of things that I know first person. One of the reasons I wrote my book was that even though there are like 100 Elvis storybooks based on the 68 special, et cetera, the authors are basically, maybe they did an interview with me, but mostly it was hearsay from people who knew Elvis first person. And I felt it was really important that I became a believer in Elvis. I mean, I think he's deservedly so, all the accolades thrown at him as a performer, et cetera, et cetera. But I also realized he's also a human being.
You wrote something in your book that really moved me. You said that you believe Elvis died of boredom, not drugs. Why do you say that?
Absolutely. I feel that strongly to this day. I think Elvis, all of his adult life and his success, wanted to go out, meet his fans, enjoy the accolades of what he had achieved. And he was one reason after another, the Colonel denied him of that. And one of the theories that I think is pretty much the truth is that the Colonel had done something in the Netherlands where he was afraid he would be, if he left the United States, that he illegally came to, never became a citizen, didn't even register when it was mandatory in World War II that every male registered for the draft. He even didn't do that on the risk of being arrested and never got caught. But he died a citizen of no country, which sort of shocked most people. Even Elvis evidently didn't know that he was not a citizen of the United States. the colonel was all made up. I mean, he was no more a Southern colonel than I was. I think Elvis, in his heart of hearts, wanted to go around the world and meet people. And I mean, it had to be so much fun for him just to, all the excitement, the energy, the accolades of being Elvis Presley. Can you imagine? I mean, just sitting in a car. I happened to have a convertible at the time, and the top was down, and I'm sitting next to Elvis Presley, who's entertaining himself with all the people in the cars next to us and so forth. I mean, I'm saying, wow, I'm lucky enough to be the guy that's sitting next to him. You can imagine how fans would have felt all over the world in meeting the real Elvis Presley.
Oh, I can't even imagine it. Now, Steve, here's another thing that really just astounds me. You were paid only $32,000 for producing and directing the greatest TV special in the history of television. Over the years, NBC, the Elvis Estate, RCA Records, and various distributors have made millions from this show. And you got no money from the soundtrack album. How could that happen?
Bluntly, by people on the other side being totally unethical. And
Colonel Parker stabbed you in the back.
Not just Colonel Parker. I mean, if you think of all the people involved in Elvis's life, who never met him, never knew him, never worked with him, and they are just raking in the big bucks. And yet, and I'm not bitter. I mean, I'm thrilled that I had the opportunity to be the guy that got to do it. And that's more important to me. My secret in my career is that no matter what shows I was doing, in certain situations, I would be told that cliche, you'll never work again. You'll never find another job. But there was always somebody there who wanted to work with me.
That may be, but I can't get over that you're the man behind that entire show, and you were left out of all of those residuals, all of that money. That's a travesty.
Well, I think in truth, the people that are involved would like the public to think that they had something to do to get involved with it. Even at the time when Elvis came to me and asked if he could live at NBC while we did the show, he had rented a home in Beverly Hills for Priscilla, and they had just welcomed Lisa Marie into the world. She was 2 months old at the time. Priscilla only came to NBC one time when we did the audience invited medley of old hits, but she never ever was involved or showed up at the studio while we did it. That was basically at Elvis's request. And the best possible thing that happened was that had Elvis not lived at NBC and had he driven to Beverly Hills every day after rehearsal or shooting, we'd have never ever done the improv. That's what inspired me to say, holy cow, this is what people have been talking about for years, but never have had the opportunity to see it in real life. And that's when I wanted to do it in the dressing room where it was really happening. And the Colonel typically, the Colonel never had a creative bone in his body in terms of, it was all about business, and it was all about one-upsmanship and so forth. And
talking about the Colonel then, what do you think of the new Elvis movie?
I loved it. I loved Baz's work. I think he took a lot of literary license in making it, but it's an entertainment film and a musical.
And how did you think the portrayal of yourself by Dacre Montgomery went?
Well, Dacre took the effort to come out and meet me before they even started production on it. And I liked him instantly. I thought he was a really good guy, and he was very humble. And to this day, we still communicate. And the one funny thing just recently, I said, Dacre, I never smoked a cigarette in my life. And he said, well, it's strange because I asked you if you drank and you said no. So I assumed you have to smoke. And, no,
That's funny. You know, in 2005, there was a TV miniseries about Elvis, and you were portrayed by Jack Noseworthy. Did you see that?
I didn't. And every portrayal, this is the only official one. Like Dick Clark made a movie on Elvis, and the guy he cast had a mustache and didn't look anything like me, but he was never able to use my name because none of them had negotiated when they made their movies. They never got permission from me to use my name and likeness. And I think that was intentional. I think they basically liked not using my name. It's the same reason that the estate, I'm sure, and the people that control his merchandise and so forth, they would definitely prefer people to think they did the special.
Now, I want to take a moment and mention this documentary that you're going to be making about the comeback special. Will Priscilla Presley be involved in the documentary?
We're now hiring the director, who will have a great deal of influence on the documentary. I'm going to be involved on the producing side, but usually, and especially on a documentary, it's all about the director who really puts the storyline together and the pictures and what have you. So it's way too early to think about casting or whatever. And I've been told that the studio that's picking it up has basically given me until the end of this year to deliver the product. So it won't even probably be airing until next year in January or so.
Well, you know, everybody can't wait to see that. I can't wait to have you back and talk about it again. Now, Steve, I hope you don't mind. I can't resist asking you about some of the other monumental events in your career. You talked about the Petula Clark special featuring Harry Belafonte. That was the first time in a primetime national TV show where a white performer and a black performer had physical contact. And despite enormous pressure from the network and the sponsor, you refused to remove that scene from the finished product. Did that give you the reputation of being a bit of a rebel?
Well, I think it started even earlier than that. But, you know, I never did it out of my ego. I did it because, you know, I felt it was the right thing to do and the way I was brought up. The sponsor, he didn't want Harry Belafonte on the show anyway. He didn't want a black man on the show. And this was all sort of fought out before we even started production. I thought it was resolved, but it obviously wasn't. And I hear him screaming, "This will never get on the air. We'll use one of the other takes where they don't touch." In the meantime, the control booth is getting wild with phone calls. NBC executive office called and said, "We don't know what's going on in the studio, but we want you to know we're behind you 100%. That was a great phone call to get. The next thing is Petula's husband, Claude Wolf, is there. And we both go down into the basement of NBC Studios where all the editing facilities are. And we go down there and I go to my editor and I say, "Okay, I want you to erase all the masters except the one where they touched." And he starts shaking. He's so nervous. He makes me sign a quickly written paper relieving him of any responsibility because nobody erases master tapes. So he does. He erases all the other takes. And NBC, because I knew if NBC had a choice, even though they were behind me, they would somehow, through the sponsor, through the client or whatever, they would use one of the other takes. And I didn't want that to happen. So the only piece of tape singing this conclusion of this anti-war song where they are tearing up, etc., is the only take that's left that they can use. And that's what aired, and that's why it became so controversial all over the world. I mean,
that's just so brilliant of you, Steve. It really is. Now, you produced and directed Lucille Ball's 1966 TV special, Lucy in London, which I absolutely loved. So much has been said about what Lucy was like to work with. What were your impressions?
We had a ball. It was a last minute thing. She called me up. I think I was in New York doing another show. And she said, I'm going to England for 30 days or what have you. I want you to meet me there and we'll do a television special. And I called my writers and they were writing the script as I was flying to London. When I got there, I said, I'm here to direct Lucy in a television special for America. And they said, no, you're not. And they locked me out of getting into the country. And it took Frank Sinatra and Ronald Reagan, I think, who convinced the English that they should let me through. And from the minute we walked through the gate, and I was exhausted from shooting the previous show, from flying to England. And we were, on the very first moment that I was allowed into the country, we were scouting for locations because we shot practically the entire show. We improvised in terms of, they were supposed to be sunny days. They turned out every day to be raining. And we had to revise the script, et cetera. But she was a ball to work with. I mean, it's unfortunate that the critics, and not all of them, but some of the critics had basically said that, you know, she should be the Lucy character that she's on her Lucy sitcom. But that's the reason she called me. She wanted to do something different. And while we shot it, she loved it. She only decided not to do any more of them because she said the critics aren't going to accept her and she didn't want to waste the time and effort. But I thought it was terrific. In fact, we had a screening of it right after we shot it, and the audience reacted to it similar to Richard Lester's Hard Day's Night, which I was, happy to hear.
Oh, well, it was a fantastic TV special. And you also worked with Diana Ross on 3 of her TV specials, including the legendary 1983 Central Park concert that got rained out partway through the show. What can you tell us about that experience?
Well, Diana is, for me, exceptional. I mean, I've worked with her not 3 times, but I think 7 or 8 times. And we've always lucked out. Central Park would have been just another Simon and Garfunkel, Barbra Streisand, whoever did Central Park before us. But we were able to make history on it because of the rainstorm. It became a news item as opposed to just a concert. And then we came back the next day and redid the whole thing. But she's always exciting to work with. She's very loyal. And we did, for instance, we did one year the Super Bowl where we brought a helicopter in to pick her up on stage and fly her out of the stadium. And that was quite an experience. We did a CBS special with Michael Jackson. Working with Diana is, I'll present the show that we want to do, and she'll say, "It's great, Steve. Now go home and start at the beginning and make it better." And that's your relationship. But she puts 110% into everything she does. And,
she sure does.
And
as you know, we just lost Olivia Newton-John last week. You directed her 1978 TV special. Can you share any special memories of working with her?
Yeah, Olivia was trying at the time to make a transition from being a kind of middle of the road pop singer to more hard-edged rock and roll, etc. The beauty of the special that I did with ABBA and Andy Gibb as her guest stars is that I decided, try something different. Can you imagine ABBA singing backup on your song where you're singing the lead? And I had them all do that. They all sang backup for each other when it came their turn to do their lead song. So it was a fun experience. I liked working with all of them. It was a real tragedy when Andy passed away. And now Olivia had been fighting, obviously, breast cancer for years. But she was real sweet and very amenable. I unfortunately didn't get involved in her next special, which was more of a concert performance.
Now, Steve, you've worked with some of the greatest music artists in the world. I know you wrote a book in 2016 called Fade Up, The Movers and Shakers of Variety Television, but will you ever write a memoir about your career?
I've already written it, actually. I'm about, well, more than halfway in. I realize it's all about show business. I want to put a little more personal life into it. And
well, that book is going to be a huge bestseller. There's nobody alive who has worked with more big music stars than you. It's been such a huge honor to having you on our show. Thank you so much for all the hours of incredible and unforgettable entertainment you've brought to the world. Thank you for writing your book, and thank you for taking the time to appear on our show.
And thank you for putting me on your show, because I love talking to you.
I have enjoyed every moment of talking with you. Thank you so much for doing our show.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Our guest has been legendary TV producer and director Steve Binder. If you're an Elvis fan, don't forget to buy his brand new book, Elvis 68 Comeback, The Story Behind the Special. And keep your eyes open for the documentary coming next year entitled Elvis and Steve, The Making of the 68 Comeback Special. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to our producer, Steve Silver. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.